You know what's really special? We didn't coordinate any of the music to the lesson or to the meditation. Spirit works in great ways, so thank you, Keith. Thank you, Patty. We are so blessed. We are so blessed. So we are going to continue our deeper dive into Scripture, and we're now working through the Christian Scriptures, the New Testament, and we are doing it in the way that they were written. The pieces of it were written, not the way they were edited. So Sonia has been working with the letters of Paul, which of course are the first part of the New Testament that were written. And now this Sunday, I'm going to work with the two Gospels that are Gospel number 1 or 2, and it's different from what you think. So the New Testament is edited to say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the first Gospel that was written is the Gospel of Mark. So we're going to talk about Mark first, and then Matthew. They are part of what is known as the Synoptic Gospels. And synoptic is a fancy word that just means read together. So if you put Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you line them up. Now, some people have something I know that's known as a parallel Bible, and it'll do that for you. But they pretty much track, but each of them are uniquely different. So the Gospel of Mark was the first one, and it was written, it's dated to about the year 70. Okay, so it's written right about the time that the temple in Jerusalem is burned. Okay, that is what's going on in the world at that time. And it was likely written in Rome, in Greek, for a Gentile audience. And again, a reminder that none of this was sacred when it was written. Okay, so each of it was written, all of the Gospels were written with a certain agenda. They almost can be considered a little bit like propaganda, not in a bad way, but they had a motive and they were trying to teach a lesson. So I'm just going to kind of go through a summary. It narrates the ministry of Jesus, and it starts with his baptism by John the Baptist. So in Mark, there is no birth story. Okay, it starts, Jesus is at the river, he gets baptized, and it's at that point that he becomes the special of God. Okay, remember the sky opens and the voice says, "This is my beloved son." Okay, so there's no early life, there's no nativity, there's none of that front end stuff in Mark. It then goes to his death, the burial of his body, and the discovery of the empty tomb. It portrays Jesus as a teacher, first and foremost, as an exorcist, as a healer, and at some level as a miracle worker. Now Mark, the Gospel of Mark scholars think was used as a source for Matthew and Luke. So Matthew and Luke had Mark, they took that gospel and they embellished it, they put their own particular spin on it. But there are things that are unique to Mark. So the first thing is, it is the shortest of the Gospels. So the Gospel of Mark is only 16 chapters. The Gospel of John is 53. Okay? There is no birth story. There's no Jesus was holy from when he was little. Okay, he becomes sacred at the time of his baptism, and he's already an adult at that point. It's the only gospel where Jesus is referred to as the Son of Mary. Okay, no father in the picture. So there's no, in the Gospel of Mark, there's no Joseph anywhere. The other thing that's really unique about the Gospel of Mark is that there's no resurrection. So the earliest copy, so they have two different versions of the Gospel of Mark, and the earliest copy that ends with the women at the tomb. So the women go, they see the stones rolled back, Jesus is not there, and they leave, and they don't tell anybody anything about what they saw. Now, there are about 2 chapters that have been edited on to the end of the original Mark, which talk about going to Galilee, and they tell the apostles and the continuation story about the resurrection, not part of Mark at all. And they think that that supplemental ending sort of came about the year 250, 300, maybe. Okay. So in summary, Jesus is announced as the Messiah and then as the Son of God. He's baptized. He is tested in the wilderness by Satan. Then John gets arrested, remember, gets his head cut off. And at that point, and only at that point, Jesus begins to preach about the kingdom of God. So scholars think that Jesus was a follower of John the Baptist and really only stepped up to kind of be the leader after John the Baptist got killed. So he gathers his disciples, he begins teaching, he drives out demons, he heals the sick, he cleanses the lepers, he kind of sort of raises the dead. The gospel is not really clear that that's what he does, but that's how it gets interpreted. He feeds the hungry, he gives sight to the blind, and he delivers all of these discourses in a format that's called parables. Okay, so the teaching method that starts in Mark is Jesus teaching by virtue of teaching stories. Whether they actually happened or not is up for discussion, but the model that he uses is to teach in stories. Then he performs mighty works, he walks on water, but only God, through the voice that comes down from heaven, and the demons in the person of Satan get it, who he really is. Because all through the Gospel of Mark, the disciples don't get it. His family don't. In the Gospel of Mark, it says his family thinks that he's crazy. You know, they come out and they hear him, they go, whoa, this is not good. You know? And they basically just kind of step back and like almost like he needs an intervention or something. And he has, in the Gospel of Mark, the beginning of his run-ins with the Jewish authorities. He goes to Jerusalem. He's hailed as someone who comes in the name of the Lord. He drives out the people in the temple who sell the animals, and that whole knocking over the tables thing. It's about that they're selling animals and that are going to be used for sacrifice. He announces the coming of the destruction of the temple. But get it, the temple's already been destroyed when this has been written. So it builds in this sense of Jesus as a prophetic agent. Okay, he's going to preach that the temple is going to be destroyed and not rebuilt, but it's already been destroyed. And then he says, and then the Son of Man will come in glory. Now, the Son of Man, Son of God, is not how we interpret it. A lot of people were called the Son of God and the Son of Man. So Alexander the Great, all of the Roman emperors, everybody was the Son of God. So all it meant was you're a pretty important person in the community that you serve. You've got some authority, you've got some power, and God gave it to you. The same way that they are all anointed. So all of the emperors of Rome were anointed, and all anointed means is they pour oil on your head. And Messiah is the Jewish word for the anointed one. So there were lots of anointed ones, lots of messiahs, and Jesus just happened to be one of them. Retained, okay? He then has a Passover and a Passover meal, and then he goes to Gethsemane. Judas betrays him. A Roman, not a Jew, a Roman Pilate condemns him and crucifies him. So this whole tradition about Jews as Jesus killers is a warped interpretation of what went down. So crucifixion is a Roman execution. If he had been convicted by the Jewish authorities, he would have been stoned. But he was crucified, and that's what the Romans did to people they deemed to be threats to the rule of the empire. So it was a political execution. They considered Jesus to be a political threat. And what they've done, and historically they did it through all of the groups. There are lots of groups that were in uprising and who were contesting the rule of the Roman Empire. They pluck out the leader, but under the assumption is that the rest of it will fall apart. Now, I just want to call your attention to look at what's happening now. This is an antiquated notion of how you win over people. You pluck out the leader. You pluck out, and then just assume everybody else is going to disperse and be compliant. Didn't work then, doesn't seem to be working now. But anyway, the women then go, after 3 days, the women go to the tomb, and there's a young man there who they assume is an angel, and he says, don't look for him here, he's not here. And in the Mark gospel, it says, but they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So in the Mark gospel, the whole notion of Jesus' resurrection, and just that's it. That's the way the gospel ends. Okay, now we're going to move to the Gospel of Matthew, and Matthew is the second book, and it was written, scholars think, about somewhere like 80 to 90, so about 20 years, almost a full generation after Mark. It's one of the synoptic gospels, and in this gospel, Matthew was written they think for a Jewish audience, trying to prove to that Jewish audience that Jesus is the new Moses. Okay, so in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is portrayed as the one who fulfills Jewish prophecy. And you could actually go through the Gospel of Matthew and then compare it to like the book of Isaiah out of the Old Testament. And entire pieces were just like lifted out. So back here it said Jesus was going to do this. Well, here it is, folks. Jesus did it. I mean, it's almost like a plagiarism of some of the Hebrew scriptures. Okay. While Mark begins with Jesus' baptism and temptation, Matthew goes back to Jesus' origins. And he then we're beginning to see this, because what happens through all of the Gospels is Jesus gets holier earlier. Okay? So in Mark, it's when he's baptized. In Matthew, it's when he's born. In Luke, it's when he's conceived. Because remember, the angel comes and Mary gets all inspired. And and then in John, he is holy before the creation of the world. Okay, so in the Gospels, they move back that place, that marker of when Jesus became God, when Jesus was God, when Jesus was holy. Matthew's primary concern, scholars think, was that he was concerned that the Jewish tradition was being diluted with now remember, because the temple isn't any longer, and for all of their history, Jews were people of the temple. They gathered at the temple in Jerusalem, they went and they made sacrifices, and then the temple was gone. And they had no anchor. There was a diaspora, which evolved eventually into the notion of synagogue. Now, a synagogue is not what we think of. Like, we think of synagogues today like Jewish churches. You know, that they're places where people go and gather. A synagogue, all that it really means is a gathering of 10 men. So it's 10 men who have been, I don't know if they had bar mitzvah back then, but 10 men who went through the process of being admitted into adulthood. If you had a gathering of 10 men, that was a synagogue. Okay, so the Jews their traditions were being diluted. They were becoming They haven't yet become, but they were becoming people of the book. So they went from people of the temple to eventually being people of the book, but they aren't there yet. So Matthew's concern is that their traditions are being diluted. So he's going to reinforce that notion of Jesus is really the new Moses. Now remember, the Matthew Gospel is where we get the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus goes to the top of the... So in the Matthew Gospel, Jesus as a baby goes down to Egypt. Remember, just like Moses went down to Egypt, he gets called up out of Egypt, just like Moses got called up out of Egypt. He creates the new law, goes to the top of a mountain for the Sermon on the Mount, just like Moses went to the top of the mountain and came down with the Ten Commandments. So it's patterned after that with the intention of convincing people that Jesus is now the new Moses. Matthew is the only gospel that has a lot of citations from the Old Testament. Like I said, there are pieces of it that look like they've been lifted wholesale. And part of that is they're trying to convince the Roman government that they are the true inheritors of the Jewish tradition. So the Romans never really got on the Jewish people because they sort of respected their age. And as long as they didn't do anything too outrageous, they kind of left them alone. Well, after the temple is destroyed, the people who are the followers of the way tried to convince the Roman authorities that they were the inheritors of that tradition. Okay, that they should be, and here we're going to prove it. We have this Messiah, and he followed all of these things that were written in our books that were called prophetic, in the way that we think of prophecy as future telling, which is not how they were written, but that's how they viewed it. So that is the environment in which Matthew happens. The other big piece that was a part of the challenge of that early community was the divinity of Jesus. Many of the people who were part of the Jewish homeland, now remember, they weren't Christians yet. So the people who were the followers of the way were still Jewish, and they were still part, but they were just following a different path. There was a lot of struggle and a lot of conflict about whether Jesus was holy, whether Jesus was God. And you see in Matthew a really strident criticism of scribes and Pharisees. Jesus says some pretty ugly things about the scribes and Pharisees in the Gospel of Matthew. And those are the people who were, Jesus really isn't holy, he's just another one of a long line of people who've come along and claimed to be prophets. So what starts to happen in Matthew is the refocusing of the tradition from just a prophet out there teaching to being holy by virtue of the resurrection. Okay, so it then becomes, the whole crucifixion, resurrection, reappearance becomes then a major focus of the tradition. And then if you pair that with the letters of Paul, it becomes the whole salvific thing. Jesus came, Jesus died, because we all needed to be saved. Now, the Gospel of Matthew has a lot of familiar teachings, like I said before, in the form of parables. And I'm going to work with just the last parable in the Gospel of Matthew, which is from Matthew chapter 25. Now, for anybody who might be looking for a Bible, this is not, I don't have any interest in this Bible, but it's called The Message, and it's written in a prose style. So it's written in a kind of more story-ish style than the regular gospel. Great place to start, especially if you're working with young people. Okay, so the parable I'm going to work with is called the parable of the sheep and the goats. So when he finally arrives, blazing in beauty and all his angels with him, the Son of Man will take his place on his glorious throne. Then all the nations will be arranged before him, and he will sort out the people, much as a shepherd sorts out sheep and goats, putting sheep to the right and goats to the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Enter, you who are blessed by my Father. Take what's coming to you in this kingdom. It's been ready for you since the world's foundation, and here is why. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was homeless, and you gave me a room. I was shivering, and you gave me clothes. I was sick, and you stopped in to visit me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then those sheep are going to say, 'Master, what are you talking about? When did I ever see you hungry and feed you? When did I ever see you thirsty and gave you a drink? When did we ever see you sick or in prison?' Then the king will say, 'I'm telling the solemn truth. Whenever you did one of these things to someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me.' Then he'll turn to the goats, the one on his left, and say, 'Get out, worthless goats. You're good for nothing but the fires of hell.' And why? Because I was hungry, and you gave me no meal. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was homeless, and you gave me no bed. I was shivering, and you gave me no clothes. I was in prison, and you never came to visit." Okay, take a breath. This is Jesus' final parable. And sometimes you save the best for last. Okay. And scholars think that this might be the summation of everything that was driving the Jesus movement at the time. And I personally am of the opinion that this story is influential for our churches today, for our church here today. So I want to take just a little time to talk about how that is, how it impacts our lives, our church, and even our nation. So Jesus imagines this final judgment and a great division among the nations. Now notice, this is not a division among individuals. He's talking about dividing the nations. Jesus said that God judges societies or nations by how well they care for the poor and the marginalized. So, how do you think we're doing? So do you hear some statistics? We have about 600,000 unhoused and homeless people in the United States today. You know that one of the biggest spikes in the homeless population in the last 2 years is elderly people whose rent and health care costs go beyond their reach. That's from the United States Census Bureau. Feed the hungry, Jesus says. So how many food insecure people live in the U.S.? Now this is an old number. These are old numbers. These are numbers from 2022, okay? According to this number, more than 34 million people are food insecure, including more than 9 million children. Visit prisons. So how are we doing with our inmates in prisons? What does our justice system look like? I think it's turned into places of pure punishment with no hope of rehabilitation. Statistics seem to say that by the time they're released, they're harder criminals than when they went in. I don't really know about that. And how are we doing about caring for the sick? 31 million Americans are without health insurance. Now remember, this is 3 years ago. Doesn't take into account what's happened recently. Millions don't seek medical and dental care because they can't afford it, and or they live in areas where it's not available. A lot of rural hospitals are closing, many, many rural communities, and you don't have to go far. You know, many of you know I have a place out in Columbus. That hospital has closed. There is nothing. You either have to come in to Katy, you have to go up to LaGrange. I mean, we're talking about an hour, 2-hour drive for people. Now, this is not to disparage our country and all the great things about it, but we can, and I think we must do better. Amen. Okay. So there are some simple things we can do. First, we can advocate for justice and make your vote count. And I don't care how you vote, but I do care that you vote. So just sort of keep it out there. And try not to make your pocketbook be the driver of how you vote. Try and make your heart be the driver of how you vote. And maybe an outlook that says what policies have a shot at alleviating some of the suffering. The second piece is that we have to move our lives from good intentions to good actions. The sheep in the passage, if you read it carefully, are those who do faith, not those who possess faith. So they do it. They do it to the best of their ability, probably not perfectly, but they do faith. And thirdly is to realize that when we care for marginalized people, it becomes for us a spiritual practice. It's as important as prayer or meditation because it lifts you. One of the best ways to get over depression or to get over a gloomy mood is to do something for somebody else. Get out of your own head and just do something. It's something as simple as bringing somebody a plate of cookies, go visit a neighbor who may be a shut-in, anything that doesn't focus on you. Amen. One of the best ways to get over. Now, we always talk about our church being about helping you advance on your spiritual journey so that you can make a positive difference in your community and your world. And now we can see how these things are linked. So our church is a tithing church, and our board every month makes a decision about where their tithes go to community groups that help people fulfill that mission. So know that by being here, you're part of that energy, but you also have to take it on personally. And that's one of the reasons why we have so many projects at this church. We have lots of projects. We are working to establish a care team. Hasn't happened yet, but we're talking about it, we're working on it, through which people will be fed and clothed and visited and comforted, maybe. Now, we all do it on an individual basis. Many of you have been part of that energy. But we're looking for ways to make that be part of our mission orientation in this church. Because you know what? We are a mission-oriented church, and we are really familiar with sheepish behavior. So we tend to be that category of the people who are put on the side of the sheep. And one of the reasons that I'm emphasizing this is that we all know a lot of communities that are what I somewhat disparagingly, I must admit, call cafeteria Christians. You know, they go through the Christian message and they only pick out the parts that they like, and then they leave the other parts that make them uncomfortable, the vegetables of the world. They leave them to one side, okay? And so, and then they spend their whole energy about talking about having to save people's souls. But the question that I live with is, what good is it to save a soul if you don't recognize or alleviate a person's suffering in this life? Amen. Like, where does that soul lives in this body now? So our leaders in this church understand that, and understand that helping people is central to our identity. It's almost like it's in our DNA. It's like it's in the unity DNA. And believe that when we move forth and we just are willing to take that action, God finds a way. Spirit finds a way for it to show up, for it to work out, sometimes in a way that we haven't even thought about, often in a way that's unexpected, but typically the right way. So, I think that in my mind, in my heart, Unity of the Woodlands has a slogan, and that is, do all the good you can in all the ways you can, as often as you can. Amen. And I see you do that. I'm seeing you do that in your volunteer work. I see you living it out in how we interact with each other, and know that that energy contributes to the peace of the universe. That when you get out there, the only thing we can affect is our individual energy, our individual going out. And so when I see all of you doing it, it makes me joyful. And so I want to take this opportunity to say thank you all for all that you do, and that and to remind you that I am blessed to be part of this community. Amen.
Amen.